Hello everyone, good morning. I hope you had a good night's sleep. Our first speaker of today is David Christian. He's with us online on the screen, I hope. He's 10 hours ahead of us, so he's the only historian who knows what the future holds. Oh, I thought he was ahead of us. That's what he told me. Thank you. But a short, he's ahead. Yeah, it's later there. So I think that's the future. A short introduction on David Christian. He's Professor Emeritus at Macquarie University in Sydney. He is by training a historian of Russia and the Soviet Union, and since the 1980s he has become interested in world history and history at a very large scale. At Macquarie University, he still teaches Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet history. For today, of course, I have to mention his sustained efforts for big history. Not only Professor Christian was the founding president of the International Big History Association, but he's also, with Bill Gates, the co-founder of the Big History Project. And since 2013, he has been director of the Big History Institute, and he's co-creator of the Big History School. Here in Amsterdam, we used to have the absolutely mind-blowing course Wereld en Mensheidsgeschiedenis, World and Human History, supervised by Goudsblom and Fred Spier, which was, of course, adopted from Christian's course. And that is also where I myself, for the first time, heard the name of David Christian. And I tell you no secret that Joop Goudsblom was a great admirer of David Christian. Professor Christian, I hope you are with us. Yeah. There he is. Good morning, good morning. It's a privilege and a pleasure to have you with us. Can you hear us? Yes, we cannot hear you. Yeah, but afterwards, with the Q&A, we will switch on your microphone. So I would suggest to start off with your lecture.
A recorded version of my talk for the Goudsblom conference. I'm hoping I'll be able to give the talk live, but just in case there are technical difficulties, I'm recording this. So apologies for not being there in person if this is the version you hear. I'd like to thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this conference. It's a real honor for me. I'm a great admirer of Joop Goudsblom's work as a scholar, and I regarded him as a friend. As a historian, I've always been bothered by the question, is there meaning in history? And I think Joop was bothered by similar questions as a sociologist. Now, yes, of course, there's meaning of many, many different kinds in history. And that explains why so many universities and schools teach history. It's full of exemplars of different types of behavior and different types of processes. But I have in mind here a specific type of meaning, and that is meaning at very large scales. Now, at the scale of all of human history. This is the sort of meaning you see when you view a landscape, not from within the landscape where you can see sort of boulders and so on, but from 50,000 feet up in the air. Or if you look at someone's lifetime. I'm living in this house with a gorgeous one-year-old granddaughter who you may even hear in the distance. We can see the beginnings of her life, but we can't see the shape of her life, whereas I'm close to the end of my life and closer to the end of my life. And so you can sort of see the shape of my life. That's the sort of meaning I have in mind. Joop was himself always interested in large-scale processes, as you know. But today, few historians and sociologists ask these sort of questions. There are several reasons. One is that they take them out of their comfort zone within their disciplines, because to look at large-scale processes, you need to cross disciplines. And another reason is that as Stephen Mennell has pointed out in several essays, in the 19th century, those who attempted to look at the overall shape of human history often came up with somewhat warped answers. In fact, Stephen wrote in an essay, writers like Herbert Spencer, in attempting to put their own society in its recent transformation in the perspective of the history of humanity as a whole, actually succeeded only in putting the whole history of humanity in the perspective of their own societies. So today, few historians ask these questions, but Joop did ask these sort of questions in many writings on long-term processes. And in fact, both of us, Joop and I, taught for many years courses in big history. And those courses look at the whole history of the universe, the largest possible scale, in the search for meaning about the past. So I hope that Joop would have enjoyed the rather speculative ideas that follow in this talk, but I'm pretty sure he would also have pushed back against some of them, and he'd have done so with grace and elegance, I know. The strange thing is that today we're in a much better position than we were a century ago to talk about large-scale processes and to ask questions about this overall shape of human history because of a vast boom in historical research of many different kinds in archaeology, geology, paleontology, genetics, and also the creation of new methods of dating events in the past, so that now we can talk about the past of human history of humanity with a chronological precision that was unthinkable a century ago. Okay, so in this talk, I'm going to ask two main questions. The first is there a clear shape, structure, pattern to human history, to the history of humanity as a species? Secondly, if there is a shape, what sort of meanings does that shape suggest about human history and the strange species of which we are members? Okay, now the first part of this talk, I'm going to try to define a shape. We should note that the idea of an overall shape to human history is not at all new. I think probably most historiographical traditions have seen some sort of shape in human history. It might be that they saw human history as static, as characterized by limited change, or as a descent from a golden age, or as a story of progress, increasing improvement, or as a series of cycles, rises and falls, or sometimes simply as a sort of chaos, or as a play directed by the gods and goddesses. So the idea of a shape is not new. What sort of shapes are suggested by modern historical research? Well, of course, you can find many possible shapes if you look for them. But I'm going to argue that the most revealing of those shapes, and the ones that are most full of meaning, all, or at least most of them, take the form of prolonged, accelerating rises in human populations, consumption of resources, ecological power, environmental impacts, and many other qualities. When did our species begin? The answer to that is not clear, and it's not crucial for this. Joop argued for a very early beginning to human history with the invention of fire, perhaps 1 million years ago. Most people would probably put the beginnings of human history later, maybe 200,000 years ago. Someone put it as late as 70,000. It's not crucial, actually, for our question, because the shapes remain essentially the same. Where are we today at this stage in human history? Today, humans can be found all over the earth. They have occupied vast number of different types of ecological niches. And in fact, in the last 10,000 years, they've started creating new niches for their own comfort. Until today, we are the dominant force for change on planet Earth. We've become a planet-changing species. Now, in these points, what do you see? You see, you see a shape. And that shape is a long, accelerating growth trend. So let's say sometime about 200,000 years ago, let's say there were no humans. Today, almost 8 billion humans. And between those two, the demographic shape of human history, and here we're looking at population as a sort of shape is roughly this shape. And we can be pretty sure about the general form of the shape, even though we can't always be sure about the details. For most of human history, in what I increasingly prefer to call the foundational era rather than the Paleolithic era, there were rises and falls, but we can be sure that on a large scale, there was growth. As humans slowly spread, particularly in the last 100,000 years, all around the surface of planet Earth. Then from about 10,000 years ago, we get a gear shift with the appearance of agriculture. Suddenly human ecological power expands very fast, and so do populations. Populations grow fast. Until 200 years ago, there were about 200 million humans, as opposed to 7 million 10,000 years ago. And then finally, things change even faster in the modern era, the era of fossil fuels. Until today, there are about 8 billion humans. Now, you can see this shape, same shape in many other processes. Here we look at energy consumption. This graph shows just the last 200 years. But to make sense of it as an index of the shape of human history as a whole, let's take this. This is consumption of traditional biofuels before we learn to exploit fossil fuels, and extend it backwards. Now, we can be pretty sure that that line, if you extend it back 50 times to the left, you reach the beginnings of the agrarian era. And we can be pretty sure that that line slowly descends as populations get smaller and smaller in the past. And if you extend it for 200,000 years, we can be pretty sure that the general shape of that line is a slow rise. And then you look at this final shape, the last 200 years, and you can see the astonishing acceleration in energy consumption in recent times. Now, in the written version of this talk, I give other examples of rising, accelerating curves of this kind. Okay. Now, in the third part of this talk, I'd like to ask the question, how do we make sense? How do we interpret this shape? Now, first, let's be clear, this is not a simple story of progress. It's our growing power. It's certainly a story of growing power, collective power, but our growing power creates new dangers as well, as the war in Ukraine reminds us, and as the latest IPCC report reminds us. And as Job argued, increasing power means increasing dependence on the technologies that give you that power. So we can no longer survive without technologies such as agriculture and associated social structures, and technologies such as the internet today. In a recent and iconoclastic history of humanity by Graeber and Wingrove, they argue that one way of thinking about human history is a history of progressive enslavement to the technologies we depend on and the social structures we depend on. So it's not a simple story of progress. One way of making sense of it is to compare this trajectory with the trajectory of the histories of other species and other complex entities. So let's try that. Even Darwin understood that there's a sort of standard shape to the histories of species. A new species emerges because it has new gifts that allow it to exploit a new environment. It exploits that environment, that niche, and its populations grow during an emergence phase. And then eventually it'll fill the niche and its populations will stabilize. Now then they will fluctuate. They may fluctuate fairly drastically during a stabilization phase or a maturation phase, whatever you want to call it, until eventually maybe hundreds of thousands of years later or millions of years later, the species eventually will go extinct, either because it evolves into something new or other species outcompete it or the niche vanishes. Now, this shape is typically a sort of table mountain shape, and you can see that in this graph here, with an emergence phase, a stabilization phase, and a collapse phase. As I taught big history, I gradually became aware that this pattern is actually typical not just of species, but of all complex things, from stars to molecules to planets to individual biographies. It's a shape you see all over in the history of the universe. And it's also, I think, very close to the shape that Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould called punctuated equilibria. because you see equilibria, but there are always fluctuations in the midst of those equilibria. So it's a sort of universal shape. Let's have a look at it more closely. The sun is an example, born 4.5 billion years ago, stabilizes for 9 billion years, and then eventually it will collapse sometime in the next 5 billion years. Biological species, the same sort of pattern. And this shape, I think, is dictated by a sort of universal tension between the forces of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, and a force for which we have no name, which is the universe's creativity, the fact that the universe can create complex things. So we have an emergence phase, a birth phase, a stabilization phase, and a death and breakdown phase. And this phase here, over here, the transition from the emergence phase to the stabilization phase, gives us the familiar S-curve of demographic histories. Okay, so that's one way of thinking about this shape. How does the shape of human history compare to this universal template? Well, it's actually very different. It's a sustained rise, as we've seen. Now, of course, that is probably because we're looking at just part of human history. We're looking at the early stages of human history. Nevertheless, the shape of human history is very weird indeed. It's an emergence phase lasting several 100,000 years. And it's an emergence phase of sustained ecological change as humans occupied niche after niche after niche, and then eventually started building their own niches. And those niches include ploughed fields as well as modern cities and dams and so on. Human history is off the charts weird. We are, in the beautiful metaphor of Didier Sonnet, dragon kings. We are known species who started to behave in utterly new ways, in ways that have never been seen before in the history of planet Earth. This is a change of planetary significance. And that is the idea captured in the increasing use of the term the Anthropocene epoch to describe today's world. Okay, next part of the talk. Can we explain this weird trajectory? Well, I think we can. And I've argued for many years a particular type of explanation, which I think is actually very close to it, overlaps with many other familiar explanations at the moment. Yes, what we must explain, I believe, is our sustained ecological and technological and scientific creativity. That's the thing we need to explain. Our ability to explore and exploit endlessly new niches. And I think what explains it is what I've called collective learning. Now, that phrase is very similar to what others call cultural accumulation or cultural evolution. The key idea is the sharing of information between individual members of a species. Now, of course, many species share information. They have culture. What makes us different is the scale on which we do this. We've crossed a threshold at which, to use the Hegelian trope, quantity turns into quality. Something new emerges. And all of this was enabled, I think, by the increased precision and fluency of human language. What this allows, this incredibly fluent exchange of information on huge scales, is for information, knowledge about how to control the environment, how to manage our surroundings, has accumulated from generation to generation over 200,000 years. And we're the first species in the history of planet Earth in which this is true. There are groups of species in which this is true, but never a single species. This process is not just a process of accumulation, it's also a process of acceleration. The reason for that is that within collective learning, there are many positive feedback loops. To give just one example, innovations in communications technologies, such as the riding of horses, improved transportation, or the internet, increase the number of people who can share information and who can dip into accumulated stores of information about how to manage the world. So it's an accelerating process as well, as innovations synergize more innovations. And that explains why for most of human history, change was so slow that it was more or less invisible to most people. Only in recent centuries has change become something that's unavoidable, that's absolutely palpable. Let me quote Alfred North Whitehead, who describes this very well indeed. He writes, in the past, the time span of important change was considerably longer than that of a single human life. Thus, mankind was trained to adapt itself to fixed conditions. Today, this time span is considerably shorter than that of human life, and accordingly, our training must prepare individuals to face a novelty of conditions. We live in a world of constant change. Okay, now in the final part of this talk, I'd like to ask where this is all going. So far, I hope you're agreed, we've seen only part of the shape of human history. Can we speculate about the final shape? Because if I'm right, it's in that final shape that we really begin to see meaning in human history. So forgive a highly speculative conclusion to this talk in which I actually look at the future. I think it's immensely important for historians to try, though few historians do it. And in fact, the historiographer R.G. Collingwood said, if you see a historian trying to talk seriously about the future, you know something's gone seriously wrong. Well, I disagree. I've just completed a book on the future, and here's the cover. It'll come out in June. So these things are very much on my mind, and I cannot resist taking these speculations seriously. But the point is that some speculations about the future are more plausible than others. So this is not a completely futile game. There are some serious ideas about the possible trajectory of human history. And let me try to unpack some of them. I will argue that some futures are simply more plausible and likely and worth taking more seriously than others. I will argue that also that historians ought to take this sort of project seriously, because thinking seriously and carefully about the future can shape how we think about the past. It can affect our historical viewpoint on the past. Besides, thinking about the future is obviously crucial to the sort of questions I'm asking in this lecture about the overall trajectory of human history. Okay. I'd like to look at three plausible future histories. Let's call them collapse, stabilization, and continuing rising trends. In doing this, I'm sort of following in the footsteps of the futurist Jim Dator, who talked for many years about four major types of futures. Here I talk about three. I simplify his model a bit. Now, all these models assume two fundamental things, and they're ideas I've already suggested. The first is the idea that history so far is a sort of emergence phase for our species. What we see so far is a prolonged emergence. Now, if that's true, it raises the question, what is the thing that's emerging? The second assumption I make in all of these scenarios is that our capacity for sustained innovation will continue. This is a defining feature of our species, collective learning. So sustained innovation will be characteristic of the future as it was of the past. Okay, let's look at some of these future scenarios, and I've sort of compressed them all onto one table. Future scenario one is collapse. Let's call it the Icarus scenario. Here it is. Under this scenario, whatever has been emerging during human history is stillborn. The creativity generated by collective learning eventually proves to be our downfall as we overreach. Now, the end could come, as we all know, through nuclear war, through engineered pandemics, through climate change. In a very interesting recent book by Toby Ord on existential crises, he actually attempts to calculate the likelihood of this collapse scenario, and he puts it at about 16%. And what's interesting is that all the collapse scenarios he analyzes, or almost all, are caused by human overreach. So that's the Icarus scenario. This is a history This is a historical trajectory. If there's meaning in it, the meaning is hubris, overreach, lack of wisdom. And the shape of human history looks like an inverted V. There it is. Future history 2, I'll call stabilization. I can't think of a fancier name for it. This is a more typical history of species, but on rather odd scales. So under this scenario, we survive, we don't collapse, but planetary limits slow down many forms of growth. So there will be a sort of stabilization. Human history gives birth to something new. And under this scenario, we can see what that new thing is. I think the best way of describing it is as a conscious planet. This is something new on cosmological scales, the emergence of an entire planet in which fundamental types of change are determined not by unconscious processes or by the interweaving of millions of decisions, but by the conscious decisions of a single species, our own. This is a conscious planet. And as we will see, conscious planets look as if they are entities capable of some form of reproduction, of spawning new conscious planets. But we can also say about the stabilization phase that it will probably be shorter than the emergence phase, which is unusual. And this is because of collective learning. Collective learning will lead first to migration to other planets. Well, we're already starting this process, and migrations are being led by robots at the moment. Secondly, it'll lead to the genetic and mechanical modification of our species. Now, that will end human history in the strict sense as the history of Homo sapiens. Under this scenario, human history conforms to the standard template, but with a long emergence phase and a short stabilization phase. And what was emerging in human history, what gives meaning to human history, is a new entity, a conscious planet. The third scenario, the third future history, is sustained emergence. This is a Promethean story. If we define humans broadly to include post-humans of many different kinds, then the stabilization phase could morph into this scenario, this third scenario. Humans, defined broadly, will migrate beyond Earth. They'll create many new conscious worlds, so that conscious worlds will multiply, and they will become more diverse. The history of Homo sapiens, defined strictly, will end within a few centuries under this scenario, through a sort of transcendence as we become new types of species. But human history in a looser sense may last for millions of years, marking the emergence of something new with its own distinctive biography and shape. That will have a history, including a history of multiplication and population growth over millions of years. We're at the start of that history. Okay, let me end by simply listing some of the sort of meanings that I think are embedded in this story. What do these speculations suggest about possible meanings in human history? I've got 4 questions and 4 quick answers, and I'm prepared to discuss them in more detail later on. First, what makes us distinctive? And what makes us distinctive under these speculations is our sustained ecological, technological, and scientific creativity, driven by what I've called collective learning. That's what makes us so different. Second, what dangers do we face? The dangers we face are the possibilities of overreach and self-destruction, which lie within the immense creativeness of collective learning. So the question for the future really is, can wisdom match cleverness? The third question, what could human history be building towards? And if I'm right, it's building towards the emergence of a new complex entity, a conscious planet. Now, such entities may, of course, have emerged elsewhere, but not in our part of the universe. A conscious planet that will reproduce and spread throughout the galaxy. And fourth, the end of human history. When will it happen and how? Under these scenarios, human history will end either through collapse and overreach or through self-modification and our replacement by new types of humans or cyborgs with a distinctive historical trajectory of their own that takes them well beyond this planet. And our history is a prelude to theirs. I thank you for your patience, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Professor Christian, for this incisive start of our day and the end of your day, I believe so. Questions? Anyone? Zoom? Yeah, Zoomers. Yeah. If you
Professor Christian, thank you very much for this wonderful, exciting presentation. It's a very grand view, and my question is: could you perhaps be somewhat more specific about the end of the human species, how it evolves into other species according to human collective learning? So that's the optimistic scenario, so to speak. But how do we do that then? And will that not involve many conflicts or disagreements about how to do it and what to do? Could you say something about that?
Yes, let me try briefly. First, I hope you were able to hear everything. I struggled to hear some parts of the talk, but it may be my internet. On the question, my own feeling is that the evidence is already overwhelming that we have the power to change our species genetically and mechanically, and in fact, we're already doing it. Brain implants, limb implants of various kinds are already possible. In China, we know that a genetically modified child has already been born. So to speculate that within 2 or 3 centuries, we will have gone some way down the path of building new types of humans is, I think, not an extreme speculation at all. And if indeed we start building colonies on other planets, the pressure to genetically and mechanically modify humans and other animals will increase greatly, because we'll be modifying them to help them adapt to those environments. And so very quickly, the idea of a single Homo sapiens with a single history will become irrelevant if these speculations are correct. Now, this could happen on a scale of, I think it's quite likely to happen on a scale of just 2 or 3 centuries, but it might take longer than that. So that's the best I can do by way of an answer. The whole transhumanist tradition that some of you may know something about is really about these changes, and transhumanists are people who are enthusiastic about them. But I agree completely with the questioner that these technologies will generate new types of conflict. And the worst scenario is a sort of Aldous Huxley scenario in which we start creating multiple human species, some of which control others. So that's a very dystopian scenario, but certainly possible.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Excellent start to our second day. Ryan Powell from the University of Sheffield. And I'd just like to ask, you mentioned about the pace of change and how during the average lifetime, the pace of change has quickened so much that we have to adapt so often to new inventions, new niches. And can you just say a little bit more about that and what implications that has for our kind of psychic structure and psychic processes? And perhaps does this relate then to what we're seeing around a youth mental health crisis on a global scale?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can say anything terribly original. I quoted A.N. Whitehead, who I think made the point very clearly that it transforms our sense of history, it transforms our sense of time, simply the increasing pace of change. And I think it's no accident that a sense of a long history, a sense of history as a story of change, is now the dominant view of history. Whereas I suspect for most of human history, the past was thought of as much like the present. Yeah, this I'm not sure that I can add anything terribly more precise or enlightening about this speed up. The evidence for it is all around it, and of course, the speed up itself may encourage us to opt for collapse scenarios, because so many of the new innovations that will be introduced fast and before we've had time to vet them could encourage collapse scenarios. I'm sorry, that's a very general answer to your question, but I won't pretend to have any more precise responses than that.
We have room for 2 more questions.
Hello, I'm Arthur Bogner, formerly from the University of Bayreuth. I would like to ask you, I've recently read the books by Harari, and I wanted to ask you about his Homo Deus, the scenario that he describes in Homo Deus, somewhat similar to a science fiction novel, an old science fiction novel entitled Colossus. But the difference is it is not one supercomputer which becomes the ruler of humanity, but it is something like the internet, or a hybrid creature which combines the internet with advances in bioengineering, genetic engineering, biological and mechanical manipulation of our capacities and of our genes, our organisms, and in actual fact, it reminds me of your keyword of the conscious planet. What do you think about this future scenario?
Yeah, I've not read Colossus, which sounds wonderful. That we will change ourselves genetically, that we will in some sense merge with machines. We're already sort of half doing it. This conversation we're having is a conversation in which machines play an absolutely crucial role. So I have no doubt that people like Harari, who are talking about these transitions, are on the right track. Trying to be more precise is probably impossible at this stage, but the idea that whatever consciousness is controlling planet Earth could well be in some sense a mixture of humans and machines, I think is very plausible. And Martin Rees has recently argued that eventually there's a very strong chance that the human part of this partnership will become less and less significant. Now, I struggle with that because of the issue of motivation. I fear that if machines ever acquire motivation, it will be very simple and perhaps very destructive. So that could be a scenario for disaster. But I don't think any of us can be more precise at this stage. And perhaps I should say that for me, as a historian, the point, well, one of the main points of this talk is to encourage historians to take more seriously speculations that they may be inclined to dismiss as pure fantasy, as science fiction. And the reason I want to do that is because those are speculations about the future really do shape how we think about the past. So this is an argument for historians taking future speculations, such as the ones we've been looking at, much more seriously than they have in the past. I hope you heard the Collingwood quote that I gave, that I think most historians probably accept. It's not our business to think about the future. I think if we don't think about the future, we won't think about the past in as interesting a way.
Thank you. I believe we have one of our Zoom participants with the final question, Wijnand Boomstra.
Yes, thank you, Professor Christian, for such a stimulating talk. It was very interesting. I've two questions. The first is I wonder if in your scenario of collapse, if there couldn't be a possibility of grace. So if a collapse could lead to a human society's surviving, but on a smaller scale, perhaps. And the other question is if I was reminded, while looking at your standard shape of a species history, of the adaptive cycle of Holling. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No, I'm not. So shall I answer the first question, and then you may have to explain the adaptive cycle that you describe. In response to the first question, in my book, there are modified collapse scenarios. This is not hard to speculate about. This is not fancy, but they are scenarios in which they're sort of collapse of the Roman Empire scenarios, in which there's a long dark ages, which could last, a millennium. And I talk a bit about the stage at which we graduate as planetary managers, in which we become good at collectively good at maintaining a planet. It could be that it'll happen within the next few decades. And actually, I'm an optimist on this. I see huge signs of very rapid change in the attitudes of politicians, not quite fast enough, but very rapid indeed. But if there is indeed a collapse in the next century or two, then it could well be that remnant populations will survive and rebuild many of the technologies we have. One of my assumptions, as I said, is that collective learning and the innovation that goes with it is intrinsic to our species. Do you know Walter M. Miller's book, A Canticle to Leibowitz? It's a wonderful 1950s science fiction thriller. And I won't, but basically the plot is exactly the one you've described. They rebuild through a sort of dark ages the technologies of the past using manuscripts from a scientist called Leibowitz, who turns out to be an atomic scientist. And eventually they rebuild atomic weapons and they use them again. So this is one of the nastiest scenarios, and it's one the SETI people have talked about. Perhaps a species like ours, wherever they arise, will hit a limit that they will find it is impossible not to collapse. So that's a scenario for multiple collapses followed by long periods of growth. And that's a very depressing scenario in my book. Sorry, the second part of your question I can't really tackle because I don't know of the idea of an adaptive cycle, although just using the language of adaptive cycle makes me think it probably is. I think most biologists, most biological demographers, if we can call them that, think in terms of patterns roughly similar to the pattern I've described. And as I say, it's a pattern I began to see all through big history. And I suspect the deepest explanation is this sort of tension between entropy and whatever it is that allows our universe to create complex things. Have I got close to answering your second question?
Yes, certainly. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm terribly sorry, but we are running out of time. We supposed to be already in our coffee break here. So I'm afraid we have to keep it with this. Thank you very much, Professor Christian, and thank you, participants and the audience here. Hope to see you next time.
Can I just thank the audience and give my apologies? I so wish I had been there in person. And I wish you all the best with the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Thank you very much.